Today on the Hobby Bench, I'll be talking about 5 Parsecs from Home, a solo sci-fi wargame from Modifius. 5 Parsecs from Home is a solo sci-fi skirmish wargame from Modifius, and it's been a few editions that have come out. Mostly it's stuff that's been on the War Games Vault earlier, and finally on about the 3rd edition, so Modifius Games picked it up and put out this really nice hardback book of this. Now, if you follow my channel for a little bit, you've noticed I've covered a few games from Modifius before. One of them is 5 Leagues from the Borderlands, and it's from the same game designer, Ivan Sorensen. I like this game. It's a fun fantasy skirmish war game. I thought I'd talk a little bit about its companion book in the sci-fi universe, 5 Parsecs from Home. Now, in general, this game is interesting. You basically have a warband, a scrappy group of soldiers sort of cruising about the galaxy a little bit, jumping from planet to planet, and just trying to find adventure and get maybe as much money or cash or notoriety over a period of time. And in this aspect, it's a little bit different from 5 Leagues from the Borderlands, where 5 Leagues from the Borderlands had these defined threats, and the goal was to reduce those threats and basically remove them from the land itself. 5 Parsecs from Home is an extremely open story. You sort of make a decision like how long you want to go. It might be something general, like I'm just going to play out about 10 turns or so. And you can just make a little bit more of a natural ending to a campaign. Just sort of play it for a while, and then, when you're sort of tired, pack it up and, restart over again. So in this aspect, it's a little different. And I think between the two, this definitely is a little bit more of a toolbox kind of setting, if you will. It's something that's a little bit more open to play. And I sort of like this too, because it is something that you can very much pick up, play a couple turns, put it down, forget about it for a while, and then jump back into it. And it works out well with that. So at the core of this game is you're going to have a crew of 6 individuals that will be the war band, if you will, or the group that you'll be browsing around the galaxy with. And themselves they have some very basic type of abilities. One is key, I think, is reactions. That's how quickly they act during a game turn. Speed is overall ground speed, how far it can move. Combat skill envelops pretty much how its ballistic or melee skill is all wrapped up in one. Toughness, how well you can take damage. And lastly, is your savvy is sort of like this catch-all skill you'll use for interaction with folks, or if you're trying to extract information from a computer or something of that sort, or do some repairs, that all falls in savvy. In addition to that, you have a couple other resources. They have called luck points and also story points. And these things are just some general currency that you can use as a metagame to just allow you to make rerolls or, alter fate somewhat if you want. Now, the crew itself, it's typically what they want to do is just, you can randomize what you want. Most of them are going to be like a baseline human. They just have regular stats. You do have a couple of alien race choices, though. And they have some things like engineers that are a little bit more tech infused, or precursors, which is almost sort of like your high elves, or they call these soulless, that basically are these automated robots. And you have a few options there, including some I think that'll be a little bit more feral, or a little bit more of a Wookiee type. You also have a couple of other character options that can be a little bit more odd. That can have like mutants or maybe even psychics. And so there's a fair amount of variation if you want, but there's nothing wrong with playing just the plain Jane humans themselves. And among that, you're going to pick out one character that's going to be your leader, and they're going to sort of have plot armor. They're going to have one luck point. They start out with that. They'll never leave the crew because of a random event, something of that sort. And of course, if they get whacked, then you can just get a new one. But, in general, that's sort of going to be your avatar for the game itself. In addition to that, afterwards, you're going to roll up a bunch of backgrounds for each of your character crew, and also some other different starting equipment that they'll have. So you'll get a nice variety through these rolling on different tables multiple times, just different changes to their base ability scores, some different equipment, that sort of thing. And on top of that, another key aspect of this game is you're going to have one ship that you're going to get. Now, what I like about this too is that you're going to start out in a certain amount of debt. So you've got this ship, but you owe a certain amount of money on it. Typically, you're going to say maybe about 20 to about 30 credits, and that's, how much that you'll have to owe on that ship. They'll also have maybe a couple of little things that you can have for your ship itself, maybe some changes to its hull type and maybe some of the different equipment it has. And after you've created that up, then you're going to pretty much work out your campaign. Now, your campaign will usually begin up with a certain upkeep. So for your entire crew of 6, you'll need to spend at least 1 credit. And credits are this abstract representation of wealth. It's actual cash or currency on hand, or maybe some other valuables, that sort of thing. In addition to that, you got to pay upkeep on your ship. And this is what I sort of like. There's interest on your ship. So basically you can put as much money as you want into it. If you don't put anything, or if you owe money up to a certain amount, it's going to be an extra credit. So if I owe, let's say 20 credits left on my ship and I haven't paid it off, well, now I owe 21. This scales a little bit. So if it's over, I think 35, then it'll be like 2 credits. If you don't do anything and you don't make any payments at all, after a while, you're going to have so much debt that you're going to have people coming after you. And so, like real life in a way, you're always going to be paying interest on that ship until you actually pay it off. And then you're free from that yoke of cost and upkeep that you're going to have to do from turn to turn. After you make that decision and your upkeep in doing that, then you have a chance to sort of explore if you want and just jump to a different planet. Or you can just stay on the planet that you have. Now, of course, if you jump to a planet, then you have these different tables to roll for travel and sort of what might happen, some random events. This is where your ship characteristics sort of come into play, because you might run through an asteroid field, or, maybe there's a patrol ship that comes by and it might cause some damage to your hull, that kind of thing. And so there'll be little aspects on your ship, some characteristics of that can sort of help out or hinder you as you're going through this. Last, you can arrive on a new world. And if you arrive on a new world in doing that, you're going to roll up some steps to sort of give a bit of a flavor for this world. Maybe it's a high-tech world. It's easier to find certain goods. Maybe there's a lot of high law enforcement. So certain type of weapons will be regulated and you can't necessarily use. Or it could be like a booming economy. Like there's just lots of opportunities out there. After you do that, then you have a chance to sort of assign and resolve different tasks for your crew. And basically, you've got 6 crew members. They can all scatter out, do different things. Some of them can support others. Basically, you can trade. You can trade and try to find gear. You can try to expand your crew. You could go also sort of explore around and sort of see what's going on. And a key part of this also is to try to find a patron. Find out like job opportunities. And depending what you choose, there's going to be different things that you roll up on. Your different tables. Like I have a trade table. And have exploration, you're sort of looking around and sort of seeing what happens to some random events. And that's sort of a fun thing. Finally, if you get a patron itself, then you can figure out, what type of job offers that they're going to have. And they'll have tables to indicate, what type of your patron is and like how much extra money that they'll spend if you complete a certain job. What's interesting about patrons too is that they usually have some sort of benefits. So as you develop your relationship with these patrons and complete missions with them, they'll have additional benefits that could be maybe better medical care or better pay, or they can give you extra rolls and trade table, that kind of thing. And so that's some sort of neat stuff that you can do with that. Also on top of that too, that, they also have this overlying quest system. So you could get these type of missions that sort of chain together as a part of a quest. And the idea is you're getting more and more information. And usually there's like a much higher payoff, once you get that MacGuffin. Once you decide that, what type of job you're going to do, then you're going to figure out like exactly like how this fight's going to be, what's going to be involved with that. Now, for doing that, it sort of comes down to the type of job that you're taking. And depending on the type of job that you have, you'll sort of figure out 4 different basic factions, if you will, or 4 basic types of opposition that you'll run up against. And there'll be a table here that you'll roll on. So example, like there might be criminal elements. And so these are going to lean more towards, maybe low-tech gangs, that kind of thing. Hired muscle might be a little bit better trained. Interested parties, these are definitely a lot more higher trained, better equipped individuals. You even have what they consider roving threats. And here could be just wild flora and fauna that you come across. You go out there, maybe exploring an area, you need to retrieve something, and you get attacked by a bunch of space bugs. That would fall into the roving threats. Now, in addition to that, if you don't have a patron, that's okay, because you always have the option, what they call an opportunity job. Something pops up, but usually like the pay is, you're sort of breaking even, you're sort of relying on maybe winning and trying to find an extra loot, that kind of thing. Whereas the patrons will give you a little bit more of a benefit from that. So there'll be subtables of everything that you roll on, And this will give you a general idea of, the opposition they'd be going against, the number of individuals, and they'll have their general spread for their speed, their combat skill, that sort of thing. What's interesting about this also is that they have a certain base AI, and it sort of dictates how they move and interact on the tabletop. And so the idea, if you have, let's say, a mindless space bug, it's probably going to be very aggressive. So it's not going to stick to cover and that sort. It's going to try to get in the melee. That's going to sort of dictate how it moves, as opposed to maybe a group that's tactically situated. In that case, like if they're in cover and they can shoot, they'll do that. If they have a chance maybe to flank, they'll get like half the group that'll do that. And so how they set up and they move in that type of AI, that's sort of dependent upon those type of individuals and that general broad AI that dictates their behavior on the tabletop. Now, when you're setting up the tabletop itself and you're setting up the battle, there can be some random conditions you can have, and you can have opportunities to say, look, you might have some weather that gets involved. You have a chance of having those type of flavors that are sort of added onto that. Now, talking about the battlefield tabletop itself, you're talking about at least 2 feet up to 3 feet. Typically, what I like to do is maybe play about 30 inches. That's a pretty good range. So most of your weapons you have, like they're going to top out typically about 24 inches, usually about 12 inches maybe for more of your close combat weapons. So there's a fair amount of range on that. Like I said, 30 inches, I think is enough to give you a chance to sort of move around and get some cover and still be doing some maneuvering. It gives you a general idea of the amount of terrain that you'll have depending on your tabletop setup. You definitely want to have quite a bit of cover, some small cover, some linear cover. Then you might have a couple larger buildings. And so it gives you some guidelines, but definitely you want to have a fair amount of cover. If you have a very sparse, open tabletop, it's pretty much going to end pretty quickly and it's going to go exceedingly bad. So that's sort of what you want. Now, to go back more about exactly how the game works is, and the overall structure of it is you're going to roll for all of your characters, and that will determine if you can get a chance to react before the enemy does. In this case here, you want to roll low. And so you roll a d6, and you'll compare that to your quickness. And if it's equal to or less, then that character can activate. Typically, most of your quicknesses is 1. So if you're going to roll a couple dice, you might get 1 or 2 if you're lucky about that, unless you invest some experience and training in increasing that stat. So those individuals then can act. After they do their action, then all the enemies are going to act. And then lastly, your characters that didn't act before will finally get the act. That pretty much covers the entire turn. Afterwards, you'll sort of check morale a little bit, and then you'll roll again and just basically start a new round. When a character or an enemy is activated, they basically have a move action and they can do a combat action. And the move action is typically optional. And the idea there is that you can basically move up to your move. There'll be some rules, let's say for climbing, maybe vaulting some simple terrain, that kind of thing. And then you have a combat action. For the combat action, it's pretty easy that you're just going to basically roll a d6 depending upon your weapon type. So let's say you have, let's say, an automatic rifle that would have 2 shots. So you can, if every time that you do a combat action with that, you'll roll 2 dice. Now, what do you need? You're rolling d6s. Generally, if something's out in the open, in close range, like within 6 inches, then you need a 3 or better. Odds are you're just going to hit it automatically. If it's a little bit further out, let's say out in the open, then you need a 5 or better. But typically, what you're going to be rolling are 6s. So anything in cover, basically, you need a 6. If you roll a natural 6, you'll automatically hit, but you're basically going to be rolling and adding your weapon skill to that. If you think about it, a typical weapon skill of 1, you're going to need a 5 or 6, basically a 1 in 3 chance of hitting something. Afterwards, then you're going to roll the damage of that weapon, and you'll get a bonus, and you want to try to get equal to or over the target's toughness. And at that point, if you've done that, they're a casualty. They're out. This game is fast and furious. You're going to have people dropping like flies left and right. Now, if they have some armor, they have a chance to do a save. And typically, again, that's going to be maybe a 6 or 5. Odds are you're not going to get it. So he who shoots first and hits is likely going to drop that person. So the idea is a game round is if you can act first, if you can move first, if you can do these things first before your enemy, then odds are you're going to go ahead and put the hurt on them. Melee is pretty simple. Basically, you're going to have a figure that's going to attack another one. They'll be locked in melee. They'll each roll, add their weapon skill, and whoever's higher will win. Now, if you get hit and you don't take enough damage to inflict a wound or take you out, basically you're going to be stunned. And that'll be a condition that remains on there. It'll take an action to say they remove it. And the idea there is that it will take up one of those two actions that you'll do later during that turn and the following turns. And the idea there is that, say, if you're stunned, you could move or do a combat action. You can't do both. If you're in melee, well, your removal is stunned, so you can fight back, but each of those stuns that you have adds basically to your opponent's weapon skill, meaning pretty much you're going to get wiped out. Now, when you're out, you're not out for characters, and there's a chance they'll probably be just wounded or knocked out, or they're just severely winded or something of that sort. But as I said, it's just fast, it's furious, it's brutal combat. You never know what's going to happen, so you want to just be a little careful with that, jumping into it. At the end of each round, you're going to roll, and you're going to sort of see if a unit panics. And so every unit will have a panic number. Typically, it's 1. Sometimes you get some, let's say, highly trained individuals, or I would want to say maybe some mindless creatures that are just absolutely starving. Or robots is a good example too. They'll never panic. They'll never run. Every time that you're dropping an opponent, and if they are, to say, within a certain range of figure that drops, you're going to get a chance that they can possibly panic. So at the end of the round, you're going to roll a die for the number of casualties that you inflict. If you roll low and roll a 1, then that figure will run. So as you're inflicting casualties, that'll give you opportunities to roll and see if any of them will run. So let's say if you can inflict 2 casualties, you roll 2 dice. And if they has that roll that's equal to or less than the score of the panic for the troopers that you have, then one of them is going to bolt. Typically, it's maybe the one that's furthest away. They're just going to basically run off the field. That is a way of basically ending the battle a little bit faster rather than killing everybody. Is just inflict enough casualties to cause the rest of them to break and run. Now, your guys will never do that. At the point at the end of the round, you can just decide, that's it, we're bugging out, we're quitting, we're leaving. And you can just basically get off and just call it a day. I want to mention also, for your opposition that you're going against, there's a chance to have some unique individuals. You're going to have some basic type of hand weapons or some basic type of melee weapons that these figures will have. But you only have some individuals that are specialists that'll have, let's say, an automatic weapon or a heavy weapon. And then you can also have some individuals that might be just a little bit more adept at combat or in maybe inspiring others, that kind of thing. There's a little bit of variation that you have with some of the individuals that you're fighting up against. There's a fair amount of gear and different kinds of weapons, and they all have a small amount of variation on maybe the amount of shots they have or the amount of damage that they do. And then there can be things that can, let's say, pierce armor, or they have an area effect, or maybe it requires you to sort of set up and not be able to move and shoot, these kind of things. But generally what I say is you're talking about typically about 10 inches or so for your short range weapons, maybe your pistols, that kind of thing, up to 12 inches, up to about 24 inches, usually your typical range for most of your longer range type weapons, which some of them go up to about 30 inches. So again, if I say you're probably playing on a 30-inch tabletop, 2.5 feet, that's probably perfect for what you'll need. And of course, there's all sorts of gear. There's defensive gear. There's deflection shields, these kind of things. And that's all sorts of cool stuff, or metal kits that can sort of keep you in the fight, that kind of stuff. It's all quite a fair amount of different gear and weapons that you can have. On the actual battles themselves, you're going to typically have a specific mission objective. Could be to access something, or to get to a center point and get something, or you're carrying something and you need to actually take it from one side of the table to the other, or you might even have a VIP. So you run in there and you have to sort of protect that individual and get them off the table. And so there's typically these type of missions that you're going to have. If you can achieve that, you sort of win the overall battle. On the flip side of that also, you can always just try to clear the table itself. That is, like, get rid of all the opposition. If you do that, typically, then you can pretty much figure you can get what you need to do to finish up and complete the mission itself. But as I said, that the fighting is so vicious, you can't necessarily count on trying to clear a tabletop. So that's going to always be a little bit difficult. And the number of opposition you will have, typically, I want to say There'll be a few more than you. So maybe you're fighting up against 8 or 10 different individuals for like your group of 6. So typically you're going to be outnumbered just a little bit. So it's definitely can be more judicious in trying to achieve your objective and win in that way rather than necessarily trying to clear the field all the time. Of course, after you finish the battle itself, then you get a chance to get paid, and sort of depending on, say, if you clear the field and you get everybody out and wipe everybody out, then you have a chance to maybe to get some loot and sort of find out some different things. And then it's sort of cool that you can get some additional training, you get some additional experience for whoever goes on the mission. And so you can use those to sort of increase your baseline abilities. And I also like this too, is at the end, you can pick out one character, they get one extra experience point, and then some sort of campaign event happens to them. And, maybe they overhear something that's interesting, so you get a rumor, or you can get some extra credits, or maybe the individual just sort of has to reflect on the comment they have, and they sort of have PTSD, and they just say, you know what? Next round, that's it. I'm out. I'm not doing anything next campaign turn. I'm just going to stay in the ship. I'm sort of done, that kind of thing. And so that's sort of a fun thing that they have in here. Now, there's some bare bones settings to this. I want to say that you think about Firefly or The Mandalorian, you're on the Outer Rim. That's the kind of setting much more than, say, something like Star Trek. And that is the idea is that you've got an Imperium, what they call the Unity, this overarching empire, or if you could say even let's say the Federation, you've got some overarching control over planets. It's very orderly. And on the outside of that is you have this fringe of space, this periphery. And this is sort of where things are a little loosey-goosey. You have a little bit more autonomous control over certain planets. And this is where that have an opportunity there for you to try to have a crew that can sort of seek out its own opportunities and do these other nefarious deeds to sort of get cash and fun. And so that sort of lines up the idea of basically for Unity heavy planets, there's a lot of authority. It's much more restrictive what you do. Whereas the periphery, gives you a lot more room to do some criminal type activities. Now, there's a fair amount of appendixes. I like these because they can just add a bit more to the game, give you some different game options. The idea, if you really want to ramp up the difficulty some more, they have these aspects of like red and black jobs that can really ramp up the opposition that you come against. I also like too that they have some different elements to the campaign itself or to actual missions that you go against. And so you can have a certain type of things that might require a little bit more than just basically interacting with something and getting that objective. Or maybe you have to do like maybe a savvy test, or do some hacking, that kind of thing. It gives you a little bit of room with that. In addition to that, which is pretty cool, is they have this different appendix to the story track. Here it is a much more structured type of campaign, and there's a bit more of a lineup of different scenarios from one to the next. And so if you want something that's a little bit loosey-goosey and a little bit more defined, it gives you that option for that. There's a couple other things like, say, cooperative play, or if you want to have, let's say, a game master that's going to sort of overarch the story that's going to be going on, you have these type of things there. And I think there's quite a different amount of optional rules that can breathe out on your game a little bit. And I want to say it's a little bit more of a toolbox. So it's a fun game. There are some detractions I'll have with this. As I mentioned, the combat is fast. It's brutal. You can spend all this time setting up a battle and it'll just run through you like you would not believe. And so that can be a little disheartening. Now you can mitigate that some because sometimes you'll get these adventure points or even luck for your leader that can allow you to do some rerolls and that kind of thing. But it's a little bit hard with that to overcome that kind of stuff there. And so I think you just have to embrace that. Tactically, I want to say too, there's a couple of options you have that say like an aim action or a few other things, but tactically it's not a very deep game. The combat's fast, it's furious, and that aspect there, I enjoy it, I appreciate it. But if you really want an exceedingly tactical type game, this isn't it. This is not Infinity. You're not going to get that type of gameplay from the actual skirmish itself. It's pretty basically D6, rolling high, rolling sixes, that's what you're trying to do. And you're going to be wiping out units left and right. There's not much that mitigates some of damage like once you get hit. So you want to keep the cover. You want to make some mad dashes to try to make sure you stay from cover to cover. Try not to get caught out in open ground, that kind of thing. There's just not a lot there. So, if you want a really deep tactical experience, these rules are not for you. but I think that what you've got here is quite serviceable. The other thing too, I'm going to say is it is a little open. It's a little bit random. And this aspect here, I think it's rather interesting because I feel it tells a story as you go through things rather than having things lined up. And so if you really want something that's very structured, like I want to know exactly what I'm going to do from this scenario to this one, and know how I'm making progress, you're not going to really find that here. It's very much this toolbox, this setting that, and even the setting itself is very loose. It's sort of what you want to define it as. There's not these intense story elements. You're pretty much running around from planet to planet, completing a bunch of missions, just trying to get a bunch of loot and gear, get some stuff for your ship to expand out the abilities that it has during sort of reduced downtime. And that's pretty much what you're working on. And even the campaign itself, there's no overarching goal. You could say, like, I want to try to get a quest and then complete that quest. And once I do that, then the game's over. I like the classic thing too. Like, I'm just going to play out 10 turns and see how far things go and sort of see what happens and just leave it at that. And so I guess in that aspect, maybe from, let's say, 5 Leagues in the Borderlands, it's a little bit more defined of a campaign. That's a little bit different with that. I'm going to mention too that, you don't necessarily even have a setting itself. It's very bare bones. Like they have something there and you can jump into that if you want, but it's completely optional. Like you don't even need it. And I think the idea there, I sort of like it from that, but I don't know. Some people may want to have a little bit more story elements in that. I will say it's procedurally done. You're rolling through different tables to sort of see what happens, what type of jobs that you're going to get, who you're going to fight up against. When you land on a planet, what's on this planet, how is it lined up, what are the things that are available. So because you're rolling on random tables, sometimes you can get some weird results. And I think you just sort of have to go with it and be flexible with that. But you might want to say, like, I really want to visit a desert planet and do this. Well, you're not going to know until you sort of get there and roll some dice and sort of see what happens. So if you want something a little more structured, that can be a downside of that. So 5 Parsecs from Home. What do I think about it? Love it. It's a fun game. I think it does what it's trying to do very well. And the idea is that you want to have this quick, light skirmish game with some role-playing light story elements into it, get some character progression, get some cool gear, and have these quick little firefights. And I think it does this very well. And it's just fun. And I think what's interesting about this is that it's a way of telling a story through things that you do. And what I mean by that is when you jump on a planet, you don't know what's going to be there until you roll on those tables. And that planet's set, and so you can have that in this larger galaxy. So if you jump to another planet, it's something different, but you can always go back to that other planet before. And the idea is that you could have some patrons there, and maybe you've burned your relations with them, or maybe you just didn't quite complete a job and they're not too happy with you, but at least you got that patron contact there that you could reach out again. Or maybe you fostered a really good relationship with them and they owe you a lot of medical services. So you go to some other planet and get torn up, and you can go back to that one and then get your guys healed up. And you have that type of thing there. And that's what I think is sort of cool, is that as you're even playing out a fight, let's say I've got a VIP and I got to get him off the board, but let's say I failed horribly and a lot of my guys got wounded, and some of my guys are out for a while, and one of my guys gets so discouraged that he decides to leave. Well, jumping into that story, you don't know what happens, but as you play through it, that narration of those events sort of unfolds, and you can sort of backtrack and say, oh, well, obviously he was maybe really despondent because felt really bad about losing that VIP, and, we weren't able to escort them safely, and that just made them very disgruntled because of their background and that sort of thing. And that's the cool thing I sort of like about this, is that you play these games out and you just sort of see what happens. And as things go along, these events happen, you sort of fill into the story of like what's going on. And that's a bit different, I think, from some other games. So I like 5 Parsecs from Home. It's a quick and dirty skirmish game. The actual battles that you have, it's pretty fun, but it's fast, it's quick, it's a little simplistic, but I'm all right with that because it's all these other little story elements that add on to that. The gear that you can get, a chance to advance the abilities of some of your guys, and some of the relationships that you build up with your patrons, or the idea of the quest. And you're slowly getting some more information here, and you're going to take another mission and get some more information, and it sort of builds up into this type of big MacGuffin that you have to get. And in addition to that, as you're moving along, you can get these rivalries, this idea of this other competing gang that's out there that eventually accumulate the point where, I want to do this mission, but no, my rivals have popped up and now I got to tackle them. And so you can have these things that sort of build on each other. And that's what sort of makes it fun quite a bit. So I got to say, for 5 Parsecs from Home as a sci-fi skirmish game, it's wonderful. It's quite a bit of fun. I think it works great because you don't need to have a lot of figures. You have a crew of, let's say, about 6. And I want to say probably maybe 8 to 12 different type of enemies that you can go against. I recommend, I want to say 2 for starfighting or pawns. Those are sort of great to have because you can always mark out some odd creatures or that sort of thing using those to sort of fill out your collection a little bit. It requires some terrain, but not overbearing amount. Let's say, I think like maybe a game like Infinity would. I think it's something to definitely check out. And so I'd say if you want to do some sci-fi wargaming and you want to sort of do something that might be a little bit more fun on the skirmish side of that, definitely check out 5 Parsecs from Home. Hope you get a chance to try it out on the tabletop.